The great hall of the Interstellar Council was built from stone like metal and shimmering glass that caught the light of 3 suns and cast it down in soft colors across the floor and walls, and every time a meeting began, the chamber filled with voices in dozens of languages, some sharp, some deep, some almost musical. And among them sat the single human representative, Daniel Cross, who had come from Earth only 3 years earlier to stand among the older species and prove that humanity had earned its place at the table. Daniel was tall with dark hair and a calm expression that hid the long hours of pressure he carried on his shoulders. Because Earth had been warned many times that one mistake, one act of defiance or arrogance could see them cast out of the council or worse, and he had to walk the line between firmness and diplomacy. With every word he spoke, yet as he sat at his station, he could feel eyes on him, cold and distrustful eyes, from species that had ruled the stars for centuries and whispered that humans were too new, too bold, too dangerous. Far away above Earth, the massive carrier USS Horizon Star floated in silence, except for the constant hum of its engines and the soft chatter of crew moving through the long corridors. Captain Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back as she studied the steady lines of stars outside the viewports, and though she looked calm, she thought about the council chamber and about Daniel, who had always been the one to argue for patience and restraint, and she knew that patience was wearing thin across the galaxy. The crew trusted her, and she knew it when young Lieutenant Alex Morgan approached with a datapad in hand, his voice steady but carrying a question that had been whispered among the lower decks for weeks. He asked if the other species really wanted humanity to be part of them, or if they were only waiting for the chance to crush them. Laura gave no easy answer. She said only that the council was a fragile balance, and sometimes fragile things broke without warning. In the cities of Earth, the people watched the council broadcasts with pride at seeing a human voice among the stars, but also with unease, for they saw how some alien delegates turned away whenever Daniel spoke and how others spoke over him as if humanity did not matter. And parents whispered to their children that humans had always faced doubters on Earth itself and had always proved them wrong, and they would do so again now among the stars. Daniel prepared for another meeting, and as he walked into the vast hall, he thought of home, of the small house he had left behind in New York, of his sister who sent him messages every week, urging him to take care of himself, and of the millions who trusted him to represent them. He felt the weight like an iron cloak, but he also felt a quiet strength, because he believed in humanity, and believed that no matter how old or proud the other races, where humans had something different, something that could not be ignored. The council chamber filled again, and the Zorath delegation entered, their scales catching the light, their eyes narrow and cruel. Daniel had learned long ago that they held deep disdain for his species. They spoke of humans as children who had stumbled into the stars without earning the right to be there. And when the council head called the meeting to order, the Zorath speaker wasted no time launching accusations of human interference in border wars. Daniel stood to respond, his voice calm, his words steady. He denied the claims with evidence and with reason, but he could feel the current in the room shifting against him. Back on Earth, President Samuel Carter watched the live feed from the council, his jaw tight, his advisors restless around him. They knew that Daniel was walking into a storm, and that if the storm broke, it would not be Daniel alone who suffered, but all of humanity. Samuel whispered that he hoped the council remembered the principles they claimed to defend, but he feared they did not. And his fear grew as he watched the faces of the other delegates. Captain Laura Mitchell received the same feed on the bridge of the Horizon Star. Her officers gathered in silence, the image of Daniel speaking filling the main screen. They watched him stand alone, surrounded by species who had ruled for centuries, his words firm, but the chamber cold. She could see it in the way the delegates shifted in their seats, in the way whispers passed from one to another. She could feel the storm as well, and it made her grip the railing of the bridge harder. Daniel ended his defense with words about trust, about unity, about the future of a council that could be stronger with humanity, not weaker. But the silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of judgment. And then the Zorath speaker demanded punishment, demanded that the human representative be made an example for all to see. And when Daniel raised his voice in protest, the gavel of the council head came down like a hammer. sealing his fate. The chamber erupted in chaos. Some delegates objected, others looked away, but the decision was swift and brutal. Guards moved. Toward Daniel, their weapons humming, he did not resist. He stood tall, his voice carrying through the hall as he said that humanity would not forget this day. And then the fire came, white-hot plasma that consumed him before the eyes of the galaxy, his last cry echoing that they would regret underestimating humanity. And then the screen went dark. On Earth. The silence that followed the broadcast was heavier than stone. People stood frozen in their homes, factories, offices, streets, watching the impossible unfold. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers clenched their fists. Young men and women who had once dreamed of peaceful stars now saw only fire and betrayal. And in that silence, a new resolve began to grow, like steel being forged. President Carter stood before the United Human Nations Assembly. His voice low but strong, he told them that their envoy had been burned alive. Not for truth, not for justice, but for the arrogance of others who thought humans would bend. He declared that humanity would not bend. And as his words echoed across the world, every person listening felt the same fire rising inside them. Captain Laura Mitchell watched the replay on the bridge, her crew silent around her. She felt the weight of history pressing down. She whispered that Daniel had walked into the fire so that humanity would never again be ignored. And when Lieutenant Morgan asked if this meant war, Laura met his eyes and said only that the decision had already been made by the Council when they lit the flames. In the following days, Earth changed. Factories shifted from peaceful production to weapons and ships. Workers volunteered in droves. Scientists turned their minds to defense and strategy, and the stars that once seemed vast and distant now seemed close and waiting. The grief of a diplomat burned alive had turned into something far greater, into unity. Laura stood before her officers, telling them that they were no longer guardians of peace, but soldiers in a war, not of their choosing, yet a war they would fight with everything they had. And as she looked into their faces, she saw no hesitation, only resolve. And in the quiet hours when the stars shone cold and distant, she remembered Daniel standing tall in the council chamber, his voice steady until the end, and she promised that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, and that the fire that had consumed him would become the fire that drove all of humanity forward. The days after the burning of Daniel Cross did not pass like normal days. They dragged like iron across the hearts of every human who had seen the broadcast or heard the whispers of it. The image of their diplomat standing tall and then vanishing in fire had carved itself into memory, and in the silence that followed there was no room left for doubt. Only anger and a cold, steady resolve spread across Earth, and every colony president, Samuel Carter, met with his council of generals and scientists. In a chamber beneath the capital city, the air heavy with tension. He had always believed in negotiation and patience, but now even he knew that the galaxy had crossed a line that could not be crossed twice. The voices around him spoke of fleets, of weapons, of alliances to be forged and enemies to be punished. Samuel listened and then spoke in a voice that left no doubt. He said, humanity had not started this war, but humanity would end it. Factories across Earth changed overnight. The hands that once built tools of exploration now built ships of steel and weapons of fire. The great shipyards in orbit worked without pause, new carriers and destroyers forming like mountains in the void, and every citizen understood why they did not complain. They volunteered for work and for service because Daniel had stood alone when the council turned on him, and now none of them would let him stand alone in death. Captain Laura Mitchell walked the decks of the Horizon Star, watching her crew transform from peacekeepers into warriors. She saw their faces, young and old faces that had once laughed at small jokes in the mess. Now set with grim purpose, she gathered them in the main hangar and spoke not with fire, but with steady words. She told them that the council had chosen violence and that humanity would answer not with weakness but with strength. Her words carried through the hangar like a steady drumbeat, and when she finished, the crew shouted not with joy, but with promise. Among them stood Lieutenant Alex Morgan, who had always been quick with a smile. Now his voice carried no laughter. When he spoke to her, he asked if they were truly ready to stand against empires older than Earth itself, and Laura answered with calm certainty that readiness was not a choice but a duty, and that humanity had always been underestimated and always survived. Alex nodded, and the fire in his eyes told her that doubt had turned to steel. The colonies, the reaction was the same. Farmers left. Their fields, miners came up from beneath the rock, engineers left their workshops, all joining the tide that rose to defend Earth, and its name even on Mars. The red planet where life had always been. Harsh banners rose high with the words that Daniel had spoken in his last breath. "You will regret underestimating us." The Zorath believed that humanity would break beneath fear, but they misjudged the human heart. They sent messages through the council boasting of their punishment of the human envoy, claiming it as a lesson for all. Yet even among the council, some species looked on in unease, for they had seen the fire in human eyes, and they whispered among themselves that perhaps the Zorath had awoken something that should have been left asleep. Laura Mitchell prepared her ship for deployment. The Horizon Star bristled with new weapons and fresh wings of fighters. Her officers trained day and night, the halls of the carrier echoing with drills and orders, yet amid the sound of preparation there was a quiet focus that made the ship feel like a blade being sharpened. She could feel it in every deck and every engine pulse that this was no longer the ship she had commanded before. It was something new, something forged for the storm to come. President Carter spoke again, this time to the whole of humanity. His voice carried across Earth and into the colonies. He spoke of Daniel Cross and how his courage in the face of death had become the spark of unity. He told them that war was not what they had wanted, but what had been forced upon them. He told them that the council had chosen arrogance and cruelty, and that humanity would show them the cost. And when his words ended, billions answered with one voice, not of fear, but of resolve. Daniel's sister watched from her home in New York. Tears on her face, but her jaw set, she whispered that her brother's voice had not been silenced. It had become the voice of all humanity. And around her the streets filled with people carrying his name, on banners his image, on walls not as a victim but as a symbol of defiance. The first fleets began to gather above Earth. Great carriers, destroyers, and cruisers, their hulls shining in the light of the sun. The Horizon Star stood among them like a sentinel, and Laura Mitchell watched from her bridge as ships formed into lines and formations. She felt the scale of it, and for a moment she allowed herself to wonder how far this would go. But then she remembered the fire and the screams, and she no longer wondered, she knew. Messages arrived from smaller species across the stars, some offering sympathy, others offering quiet support. A few even offering ships and soldiers, for they too had suffered beneath the arrogance of the council. And now, they saw in humanity a chance for change. Laura read those messages carefully and felt a flicker of hope, because humanity was no longer alone. It was becoming the center of something greater. The Zorath, however, prepared for war with their own pride. They sent fleets to their borders and broadcast messages of dominance. They called humans reckless children, who had dared too much and would now be burned out of the stars. Their threats filled the channels, but humanity no longer listened. They were too busy building, too busy preparing. One night, Laura stood alone on the observation deck of the Horizon Star, watching Earth below its lights, glowing against the darkness. She thought of Daniel. She thought of the weight he had carried and the fire that had taken him. She whispered that he had been a diplomat, but his death had made him something else, something no weapon could destroy, and she promised that his sacrifice would be answered. Lieutenant Morgan found her there, his voice quiet, as he said that the crew needed her to keep standing strong, and she looked at him with tired eyes but firm resolve. She told him that strength was not something she gave them. It was something they already had, something every human carried, and that the council had just reminded them of it. He nodded, and for a long moment they stood together in silence, watching the stars where the future waited. The first orders came within days. Fleets were to move toward the Zorath border. Humanity would not wait to be struck. They would carry the war to those who had started it. Laura gathered her officers on the bridge, told them that their time of waiting was over, and that history would judge them not for their fear, but for their courage. They listened in silence, then moved to their stations, the ship coming alive around them. And as the Horizon Star turned its bow toward the stars, the crew felt the weight of what was coming. They knew that battles lay ahead, that blood would be spilled, but they also knew that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a story that had begun with fire in a council chamber, and would end only when justice had been written across the stars. When the first wave of fleets left Earth, the people watched them rise through the skies and vanish into the black of space, and every eye followed with silent prayers and with unspoken promises that those ships would carry justice with them. The Horizon Star stood among them at the front of the line, its hull gleaming with the new weapons that had been forged in record time, its engines burning bright, as if carrying the anger of an entire world. Captain Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge, surrounded by her officers, her hands steady. Her voice calm, though inside her chest a storm was waiting to be released. She had seen her crew train. She had seen them transform from explorers into soldiers, and now they were about to take their first step into a war that had been forced upon them. President Samuel Carter watched from the command center beneath the Capitol, the vast screens showing the fleets moving in perfect formation. He said nothing at first, just watched the endless lines of human ships rising into space. Then he spoke to the generals around him and told them that history would not remember who fired first. It would remember who refused to bow, and that was what humanity was doing, refusing to bow. He knew the price would be high, but he also knew that silence would cost far more. Across the colonies, the people gathered in city squares watching the broadcasts, cheering the names of ships as they departed, and holding banners with the face of Daniel Cross no longer shown as a victim but as a symbol of defiance. Children waved flags, families embraced young men and women signed up for service. Even though they knew they might never return, they did it not out of hate, but out of determination, because they wanted the galaxy to know that humans would not be broken. The Horizon Star crossed into the borderlands where the Zorath had long ruled with fear. Their colonies stretched across dark space, their patrols ruthless and efficient, but they had grown arrogant, believing no young species could match them. Laura Mitchell stood at the center of her bridge studying the tactical display as reports came in of enemy positions, her voice steady as she gave orders, her officers moving quickly to carry them out. Lieutenant Alex Morgan monitored communications, his hands moving fast across the console, and he looked up to say that the Zorath were already aware of their presence and were calling them reckless invaders. Laura answered with a single sentence. She said, "We are not invaders, we are answering." The first battle came swift. A Zorath patrol fleet appeared, their ships angular and black, cutting through the stars with cold precision. They opened fire without warning, plasma bolts streaking across the void. Laura stood unflinching. She ordered the Horizon Star to return fire, and in an instant the black silence exploded into chaos. Fighters poured from the human carrier engines, roaring as they raced into the fray, and the crew of the Horizon Star worked with relentless focus, their training now tested by fire. The clash was brutal. Human ships took damage, but their response was faster, sharper than the Zorath expected. Missiles streaked through the void, finding their targets and tearing enemy ships apart. Laura gave orders with calm clarity, directing her fleets into formations that caught the Zorath off guard. For the first time in centuries, the reptilian warriors faced an enemy that did not break before their show of strength. Instead, humanity pressed forward, and when the last enemy ship was torn apart, silence fell across the stars. The crew of the Horizon Star did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They stood in the aftermath, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of what they had just done. Ensign Maria Clark whispered that this was only the beginning, and Laura answered that beginnings were powerful, because they decided everything that came after. She told them that they had proven something not just to the Zorath, but to themselves. Reports spread quickly across the galaxy. Smaller species who had long suffered under the arrogance of the Council heard that humans had stood against the Zorath and not only survived, but won. Whispers traveled faster than light. They said the humans fight like no other. They said the humans do not surrender. And for the first time in generations, hope began to stir in places where there had only been fear. Back on Earth, President Carter addressed the world once again. His voice steady, he told them that the first clash had ended in victory, but that the war was only beginning. He warned them not to see triumph too soon, but to prepare for the long struggle ahead. Yet even as he spoke, he could not hide the pride in his voice, the pride of seeing humanity stand tall where others had fallen. He ended his speech by saying that Daniel Cross had been silenced in fire, but now his words were being spoken in steel. The Zorath responded with fury, their leaders sending Threats across the stars, they vowed to bring Earth to ashes, to crush humanity so completely that no one would ever remember their name. They sent fleets larger than anything humanity had seen before, entire armadas moving from their core worlds toward the border. The council watched in silence, some uneasy, some eager to see the humans punished, but none willing to intervene. Laura Mitchell received the intelligence reports and called her officers to the war room. She told them that the storm was coming and that humanity would meet it head-on. The crew of the Horizon Star prepared for the next wave. They repaired damaged, refueled fighters trained with relentless discipline, and through it all, they carried the memory of the first battle, with them a memory that said the enemy could be beaten. Laura walked among them, speaking to engineers, mechanics, pilots. She told them each in simple words that what they were doing mattered, that every bolt tightened, every system checked, was part of something far greater, and they believed her because she believed it herself. On Mars, the first human armada began to assemble ships from Earth, joined by ships from the colonies, stretching in long lines across the void, their names painted boldly: Liberty, Independence, Valiant, Courage, each one carrying thousands of souls ready to fight. Laura looked at the armada from the observation deck of the Horizon Star and felt the scale of it. She whispered that humanity had been underestimated, and now the galaxy would see what that meant. Daniel's sister received a private message from President Carter inviting her to speak at a memorial held for her brother. She stood before millions, her voice trembling but strong. She said that her brother had believed in peace until the end, but that his death had shown the galaxy the truth of humanity. She said that he had not been destroyed. He had been multiplied in the heart of every human watching, and her words spread far and wide, carried into the stars by broadcasts and by the voices of those who believed them. When the next Zorath fleet came, it was larger, stronger, filled with ships bristling with weapons they expected to crush the humans with sheer numbers, but they did not expect the unity and precision that humanity now carried. The battle raged for hours. Fire and metal tearing across the void, Laura commanded, with iron calm directing her fleets into traps and counterstrikes. Alex Morgan worked tirelessly at communications, feeding her the flow of information, and Maria Clark led squadrons of fighters in desperate maneuvers that turned the tide ships were lost, lives were sacrificed, but the humans did not break. They adapted, they pushed, they endured, and when the Zorath finally retreated, dragging their shattered ships back into the dark, the galaxy could no longer deny it. Humanity had declared war, and humanity had shown that they could fight it. On Earth, people poured into the streets when the news arrived, not with cheers of easy victory, but with pride of hard-fought survival. They lit candles for the fallen, they raised banners for the living, and they whispered the name of Daniel Cross, as if it were a promise. President Carter stood again before the assembly, his voice hoarse but steady. He said that the war was not yet won, but that the path had been set and there was no turning back. He said the council had chosen to burn their diplomat, and now the stars themselves would burn with the fury. They had unleashed. Laura Mitchell stood in the command center of the Horizon Star, watching her crew exhausted but unbroken. She spoke softly, but every ear heard her. She said, "This is what it means to be human, to stand in the fire and refuse to fall." And the words carried through the decks and into the hearts of her people, who stood taller because of them. And so the war moved forward like a tide that could not be stopped, carrying humanity deeper into the stars, into battles that would test them, into choices that would define them. And as the Horizon Star turned once more toward the enemy, Laura Mitchell thought of Daniel Cross and of the day he had burned, and she swore again that his voice would never be silenced. Not while humanity still breathed, not while the stars still shone. The war was no longer a whisper in the council chambers or a quiet debate in hidden rooms. It was now a storm that had broken across the stars, and every race in the galaxy could feel its winds sweeping through the void. Humanity had moved from defense to retaliation, carrying fleets into the dark edges of Zorath space, striking with precision and fury that left even their allies shocked. The Horizon Star was no longer only a ship. It had become a symbol of the human will, and every time it appeared in battle, the enemy hesitated for just a breath. That hesitation was often the difference between life and death. Captain Laura Mitchell stood at the center of her bridge as another mission began, her eyes scanning the holographic map, Of enemy positions, intelligence reported that a major Zorath supply hub lay ahead, defended by heavy ships and orbital platforms. Her officers waited for her orders, the silence of expectation heavy in the air. Laura finally spoke, her voice steady. She said, "We will strike fast, we will strike clean, and we will leave nothing behind." Her words were not shouted, yet they carried through every deck with the weight of iron. Lieutenant Alex Morgan worked the communication channels, intercepting enemy signals, his fingers moving across controls as he reported that the Zorath were already aware of their approach. He looked up at Laura, his eyes filled with determination. He said, "They know we are coming," and she answered simply, "Then let them wait." The crew heard it, and their resolve sharpened. Fighters prepared for launch, pilots strapped into cockpits, mechanics cleared the decks, engineers powered up weapons. The heartbeat of the ship quickened. When the Horizon Star and its fleet dropped out, of faster-than-light travel, the supply hub came into view, vast structures suspended in orbit around a barren moon, guarded by cruisers and destroyers bristling with weapons. The Zorath were ready, their ships turning to meet the human armada, plasma cannons glowing with deadly light, but humanity did not hesitate. Laura gave the order, and the battle began. The void lit with fire missiles streaked from human ships, cutting paths through the dark plasma bolts, answered back shattering shields, and tearing metal fighters swarmed into the chaos, darting between giants like sparks from a forge. Maria Clark led her squadron with fearless skill, weaving through enemy fire and striking at weak points. Her voice came over comms, calm but urgent, as she directed her wingmen into formation. Her courage burned bright, and the others followed without question. On the bridge, Laura commanded with precision, her orders clear, never wasting a word. She guided her fleets into flanking maneuvers, drawing the Zorath ships out of position and then crushing them with concentrated fire. Alex Morgan relayed constant updates, intercepting enemy orders and feeding her openings. His voice steady, even as alarms blared around him. The crew worked as one, their fear drowned beneath the steady rhythm of purpose. Hours passed like moments, the battle raged, the void filled with wreckage. Human ships took losses, every explosion, a wound that cut deep, but they did not falter. Instead, they pressed harder, pushing through fire and steel, until at last the hub itself fell, orbital platforms silenced and shattered, the Zorath supply lines burning in the cold of space. Silence returned at last, broken only by the heavy breaths of those who had survived. Laura stood at the viewport, staring at the destruction, her reflection caught in the glass. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She whispered quietly for Daniel Cross, and every ear nearby heard it and bowed their heads, because they knew that every battle they fought was for him and for the fire that had begun with his death. News of the victory spread quickly across the galaxy. Smaller races who had long feared the Zorath now began to whisper more openly of support. Messages reached Earth, offering alliances and supplies. Voices that had once been silent now found courage in the shadow of human defiance. President Samuel Carter listened to those messages, his face set with grim satisfaction. He told his council that humanity was no longer fighting alone. The tide was shifting, though the cost was only beginning to be counted. The Zorath, however, were enraged. Their leaders howled in fury. Broadcasting threats across every channel, they promised to crush Earth itself, to rain fire on its cities, to make the humans beg for mercy. And their rage carried into their fleets, driving them forward in a desperate attempt to regain control. They sent armadas larger than anything humanity had faced yet. The Horizon Star was recalled to join the main fleet, assembling at the edge of Sol space, the largest human armada ever gathered. Thousands of ships, carriers, destroyers, frigates, all forged in the fire of unity. Laura arrived with her crew and saw the vast lines of ships stretching farther than the eye could follow. She stood on the observation deck and whispered that Daniel Cross had once stood alone. But now he stood in all of them, and Alex Morgan at her side said, "Then let the galaxy hear him loud." The armada prepared for the clash that would decide the course of the war, every ship ready, every crew waiting with silent tension. Earth itself watched from below, billions of eyes turned upward, knowing that everything hung on the strength of those ships in the dark. President Carter addressed the world once more, his voice steady. He said, "The council burned our diplomat and thought they had silenced us. But today the stars themselves will carry our answer." His words carried like thunder across every screen, across every heart. When the Zorath armada came, The void shook with its size, ships black and gleaming with power stretching across the horizon, their weapons glowing like a storm ready to break, and for a moment even the bravest felt the weight of fear. But Laura Mitchell stood on, her bridge calm as stone. Her voice cutting through the silence, she said, "We do not bow, we do not break, we are humanity. And today, they will learn it." The battle that followed was like nothing the galaxy had seen in centuries. The void itself seemed to burn as fleets clashed, weapons tearing through shields, fighters swarming like fire across the black. Human ships fell, but they did not retreat. They held their lines, they adapted. They struck back with fury, every loss answered with tenfold resolve. Laura guided her fleets through the storm, her orders sharp, her eyes unyielding. Alex Morgan relayed every opening, every weakness. Maria Clark led wave after wave of fighters. Even as her squadron numbers dwindled, her voice never shaking. The Zorath pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, their weapons devastating. But humanity refused to bend. They fought with a ferocity that stunned their enemies, with creativity that no one had expected, using maneuvers and tactics born from desperation and brilliance combined. They turned the tide strike by strike, blow by blow, until at last the Zorath line wavered, then cracked, then broke, their great armada retreating in disarray, leaving behind wreckage burning across the stars. The silence after the storm was heavy. The crew of the Horizon Star, exhausted, bruised, bloodied, but alive. Laura looked across her bridge at the faces of her people, and she told them that this was not the end, but it was the proof that humanity could not be broken. She said the Council wanted an example. They would now have one written in fire across the galaxy on Earth. The news of the victory brought tears and cheers alike. People poured into the streets, lighting torches and holding banners with the name of Daniel Cross, his image painted now not as a victim, but as a spark that had lit the greatest fire humanity had ever carried. President Carter stood before his people, telling them that the war was far from finished, but that the future had already been changed, and that the Council would never again look at humanity as weak. And aboard the Horizon Star, Laura Mitchell stood at the viewport, staring into the endless dark. Her crew silent behind her. She whispered again for Daniel Cross, and for every soul who had fallen, and then she turned to her people and said, "The stars belong to those who dare to stand, and we will never kneel." The war had reached a point where no one could deny that the galaxy had changed forever. Humanity was no longer a young race sitting quietly at the edge of the Council waiting for approval. They had become a storm, a force that could not be ignored. The victory against the Zorath Armada had spread like fire across the stars, and everywhere the news traveled. Smaller species began to raise their voices against the old order. They whispered the name of Daniel Cross as if it were a banner they carried, and they turned their eyes toward Earth for guidance. On Earth, President Samuel Carter sat in the war room with his generals, the maps of the galaxy spread before them, glowing with red lines of enemy control and blue lines of human advance. He listened to reports of new alliances, ships pledged by smaller races tired of Zorath domination, supplies and technology flowing to Earth in secret. Carter leaned forward. His hands clasped, his voice steady, as he told them that this was no longer only a war of survival. It was now a war to reshape the galaxy, and that humanity carried the weight of that future. Above Mars, the great armada of humanity continued to grow. Its ships scarred from battles, but repaired, its crews tired but unbroken. Captain Laura Mitchell walked the bridge of the Horizon Star. Watching as more allies joined the line, she saw vessels of alien design taking position beside human carriers, their crews sending silent signals of loyalty. She felt the change deep in her chest for the first time. Humanity was not alone. They were leading something larger, a tide of unity that had never before existed. In the galaxy, Lieutenant Alex Morgan worked at the communications console, his voice calm as he relayed incoming signals. He told Laura that 3 more systems had declared their support, 2 of them offering fleets of small ships, the other offering safe passage routes through contested space. Laura nodded and answered that every ally mattered, no matter how small, because every voice added to the chorus rising against the Council. Maria Clark, meanwhile, stood in the hangar with her pilots, teaching new allies how to fly in human formations, her voice steady and patient, though her eyes carried the weight of losses she had seen. She knew that every new pilot trained meant another chance for survival in the storm ahead. The Zorath, however, refused to bend their fury greater. With every defeat, they rallied what remained of their strength, calling on old allies within the council to stand with them. Some races answered out of fear. Others remained silent, watching the balance tip. But the Zorath leaders swore they would burn Earth itself. They swore they would erase humanity from history. Their broadcasts, filled with venom, their fleets gathering once more in the dark. Laura Mitchell received the intelligence reports. She gathered her officers in the war room of the Horizon Star. The lights dim, the map glowing before them. She told them that the Zorath were massing for a final strike, that they would throw everything they had to crush humanity before it grew too strong. Her officers listened, their faces grim, yet resolute. Alex Morgan said, "If they bring everything, then we break everything." Maria Clark added, "Then the galaxy will know who truly stands." Laura looked at them both and answered, "Then we will prepare." Preparations spread across every human world. Factories doubled their output, shipyards worked without pause, training camps filled. With volunteers, even as losses mounted, there was no hesitation. Only determination. On Earth, families gathered to say farewell to sons and daughters, knowing that they might never return, but also knowing that their sacrifice carried meaning. People painted the name of Daniel Cross on walls and on ships and on banners, as if invoking his spirit to march with them. President Carter addressed the world again, his voice hoarse but strong. He said the council burned our Diplomat and thought it would silence us instead. They forged our unity. They thought they ended us. Instead, they awakened us. He told his people that the coming battle would be the greatest test in human history, and that every life given would write the story of their future. His words carried across the colonies and into the hearts of billions who stood ready. The Horizon Star moved with the Armada toward the frontier where the final clash would come. Laura stood at the viewport, watching the endless lines of ships, human and allied, stretching into the dark. She thought of the weight upon her shoulders, yet she carried it with calm, because she knew that this was no longer about her, or even about humanity alone. It was about every race that had lived under fear for too long and now saw in humans the courage to rise. When the Zorath Armada finally appeared, it was like a wall of darkness stretching across the stars, their ships countless, their weapons glowing, their voices broadcast with promises of annihilation. But humanity did not flinch. Laura Mitchell stood tall on her bridge, her crew silent, awaiting her words. She said, "Today, the galaxy learns what it means when humans say we do not bow." Her voice cut through the silence like steel, and the crew answered with steady resolve. The battle began with a roar, the void alive with fire missiles, streaking plasma bolts, shattering shields, fighters swarming in waves, the Horizon Star at the center of the storm. Laura gave orders with calm precision. Alex Morgan, feeding her constant streams of intercepted signals. Maria Clark leading squadrons into the heart of the enemy. The clash raged with a fury that shook even the oldest veteran ships, torn apart, men and women giving their lives in desperate maneuvers. But through it all, the human armada held, hours stretched into eternity. The Zorath pressed with everything they had, their numbers overwhelming, their fury unending. But humanity adapted. They fought with creativity, with relentless will. They struck at weak points, they turned traps into opportunities, they sacrificed when needed, but never surrendered, and slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. Laura Mitchell stood unyielding, her eyes fixed on the tactical map, her voice steady as she ordered her fleets into a final push. She told them that this was the moment to decide the future. Her words carried through every channel, into every ship, and every crew felt the fire ignite once more. They surged forward, weapons blazing, engines burning, the void filled with light as the human and allied fleets broke through the Zorath line. The enemy flagship loomed ahead, a massive fortress bristling with weapons. Laura ordered the Horizon Star to lead the charge. Alex Morgan called out coordinates. Maria Clark and her remaining fighters cleared the path. The Horizon Star unleashed its full arsenal, tearing through the defenses until at last the flagship erupted in fire, the explosion lighting the void like a second sun. The Zorath Armada wavered, their resolve shattering as their symbol of power was consumed. Silence followed, broken only by the cheers of the survivors. Though many did not cheer, they simply sat in exhaustion, tears mixing with sweat, knowing how many had been lost. But also, knowing what they had achieved. Laura stood on her bridge, her voice soft but firm. She said, "For Daniel Cross, for every soul lost, and for every soul yet to live, we have shown them." Across the galaxy, the shock was felt. The Zorath were broken. Their arrogance crushed smaller races rose openly, now joining the human alliance. The council itself trembled. Its authority cracked. President Carter spoke once more, telling the galaxy that humanity had not sought war, but humanity would never again be silent. His words echoed in every corner where fear had once ruled and the fire of hope spread. Laura Mitchell stood at the viewport of the Horizon Star, scarred but unbroken, her crew around her. She whispered that the war was not yet finished, but the tide had turned. She looked at Alex Morgan and Maria Clark and saw in their faces the same truth they had seen in hers. They would carry this fire until the end, until the galaxy knew the full meaning of humanity. The galaxy was no longer the same after the destruction of the Zorath flagship. Yet even as their forces broke and scattered, the war was not finished. Fragments of their fleets fled into the dark corners of space, hiding in old strongholds and regrouping. With bitter anger, the council itself sat fractured, its chambers filled with fear and silence. As messages from across the stars declared new loyalties and old allegiances crumbled one by one. On Earth, President Samuel Carter met with his council, his face drawn with exhaustion, yet his eyes still burning with determination. He listened to the reports of victory and of loss. Every name read aloud carried the weight of sacrifice. Carter stood before his generals and said, "The Zorath are broken, but not gone, and the council is crumbling but not finished." He told them that humanity must not stop here, that the war was more than survival. Now, it was about building a new order where no race would ever again burn a voice for speaking the truth. Above, Mars, the Horizon Star, drifted in orbit surrounded by fleets that bore scars from countless battles. Engineers worked endlessly, patching hulls and replacing weapons. Pilots slept where they could, their dreams filled with flashes of fire and silence. Captain Laura Mitchell stood at the viewport, her reflection staring back at her. She thought of Daniel Cross, his quiet strength, his words that had been burned away by the council yet lived louder now than ever before. Alex Morgan approached her quietly and told her that more allies had joined fleets from distant systems carrying banners painted with the human symbol. Laura nodded, her voice soft but steady. She said, "Then the galaxy has chosen Maria." Clark walked through the hangar speaking to young pilots who had never seen the beginning of the war but had grown up under its shadow. They looked at her with wide eyes, knowing her reputation. She told them to fly, not with fear, but with purpose. She said, "Every strike you make, every risk you take is not for glory. It is for the voices who cannot speak anymore." They listened and their hands trembled less. The remnants of the Zorath struck where they could, raiding colonies, ambushing supply lines, spreading terror in desperate attempts. To hold ground, humanity answered with unyielding force. Fleets launched into the dark, chasing them system by system. Refusing to allow them refuge, the Horizon Star led many of those hunts, striking like a blade of light through the void. Laura gave no quarter, her order sharp, her resolve unbroken. Alex Morgan intercepted enemy codes and broke their networks. Maria Clark and her wing cut through their fighters with relentless fire. The Zorath learned that no corner of the galaxy would shield them. But the greater challenge was not only in the battles, it was in what came after. As systems freed themselves from the grip of fear, they turned to humanity for guidance. Small races once ignored, now asked for protection, for trade, for unity. President Carter faced a new weight. He stood before the leaders of the new alliance in a great chamber built in orbit above Earth. He told them that humanity did not seek to rule but to stand together. He said the council ruled through fear, but we will build through trust. His voice carried and the leaders listened. Yet the old council still lingered, fractured but dangerous. They tried to rally what allies they could, whispering promises of safety in return for loyalty. They feared humanity, feared the fire that had been lit. President Carter knew they would not surrender willingly. He told Laura Mitchell that the Horizon Star and the fleet must stand ready for one last strike to break the council completely. The Horizon Star sailed again into the stars, leading the armada toward the heart of council space. Defenses rose to meet them, vast fleets desperate to hold the line. The battle that followed was brutal. Every ship engaged, every weapon fired the void, burning with light. Laura commanded, With calm steel, Alex Morgan fed her every opening. Maria Clark cut through enemy fighters like a storm. The Allied fleets followed humanity without hesitation, the tide of unity striking against the walls of the old order. Hours stretched into days. As the fighting raged, the Council defenses fell one by one, their fleets breaking, their stations burning, until at last the Horizon Star stood before the Council world, its towers gleaming in the light of the nearest star. Laura gave the order. The defenses fell. Silence stretched across the chamber of the Council as human soldiers entered. President Carter stood before their leaders, his voice steady. He said, "You burned our diplomat and thought you silenced us instead. You lit a fire that you cannot contain," he told them. "The Council is finished. A new order will rise, one built not on fear but on the strength of every voice." The old leaders bowed their heads in defeat. Some fled into exile, others stood silent, their power broken across the galaxy. News spread the Council that had ruled for centuries was no more. Humanity had not only survived, it had reshaped the stars. On Earth, people filled the streets, their voices raised in joy and in sorrow. Torches lit the night skies, banners carried the name of Daniel Cross, his face now carved into monuments across cities, not as a victim, but as a symbol of defiance. President Carter addressed his people one final time. His voice heavy yet proud, he said, "We began this war in pain. We fought it in fire, and we end it with hope. The galaxy will never again look at us as silent. We are humanity, and we stand aboard the Horizon Star." Laura Mitchell stood with Alex Morgan and Maria Clark. Her crew gathered around her. She looked at the stars, endless and dark, and yet no longer filled with fear. She whispered, "Daniel Cross, you are not forgotten. You live in every voice that speaks today." She turned to her crew, her voice steady. She said, "The galaxy belongs to those who dare to stand, and we will never kneel." And the crew answered with silence filled with pride. The war was over, but the journey was only beginning. Humanity had declared itself, and the stars had answered. The horizon stretched endless before them, and they stepped forward together, unbroken.